time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. After nearly 2 years of shutting down its border with China, almost fully isolating itself from the rest of the world, North Korea's economy is believed to be weaker than ever before, hit by the impact of international sanctions, COVID-19, natural disasters, and a food shortage. Recently, though, there have been reports that there are glimmers of resumed activity around the border as the regime looks to resume trade with Beijing. However, questions remain over how much the North Korean economy can actually recover amid the global supply chain crisis and the prolonged pandemic. And to discuss these and recent developments today, we connect with Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Study Center, who worked around 20 years in US intelligence, including as the CIA's Deputy Division Chief. Very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, we've got quite a lot of ground to cover, so let's go straight into the questions. And well, North Korea, it closed its border in 2020 in the month of January, and it shut down all trade activities with China, which is its largest trade partner, due to concerns over the spread of COVID-19. What impact has this had on North Korea's economy, which was already suffering quite a lot, and also what impact has it had on the livelihoods of its people?
It's had a cumulative effect, along with the long-standing problems that the regime has imposed on its population, given its socialist economic policy. So the economy is always bad, and that's been also impacted by the effect of sanctions enforcement, even though they're not being fully enforced. And then the self-imposed COVID restrictions certainly exacerbated the problem. So in North Korea even cut off its state-sponsored smuggling with China for a while. But then, as we saw in parades in October of last year and January this year, they're still able to produce a massive number of new missile systems as well as conventional weapon systems. But certainly it's had an impact on their economy.
And well, it looks like they're trying to resume more trade with China, but right now the world is going through a severe supply shortage crisis, from commodities and children's toys to computer chips and even cars. There's just a shortage of everything. And although Pyongyang has isolated itself from the world's economy, its biggest trading partner, it is China, after all, and China is at the center of this supply chain crunch. Do you expect this supply chain crisis to affect North Korea as well?
Well, North Korea had supply chain problems long before there were supply chain problems because of their economy and the economic decisions that they made, the prioritization of the military over the well-being of its populace. So, but the supply chain problems that the world is currently facing will certainly not make things any easier for the North Korean economy when they try to reopen. So we've seen indications that North Korean Chinese trade might have started resuming, but then very recently indications that COVID restrictions on the Chinese side may have stopped what had seemed to be an initial resumption of trade. So North Korea's cutting itself off certainly has exacerbated the problems that the economy, of the national economy, has had, as well as the well-being of the people, including the food situation, which was also impacted by natural disasters that they had last year.
Amid concerns over North Korea's livelihoods and its domestic situation, China and Russia, they're pushing for the easing of international sanctions on Pyongyang, while the United States is calling on Beijing to stand by the global sanctions and steer its neighbor onto the right path. Do you think these two sides are going to continue to move in opposite directions?
Very much so, and that's been the case for years, if not decades. Particularly China will act like North Korea's lawyer in the UN Security Council, turning a blind eye to North Korean violations or Chinese violations of the UN sanctions, and always advocate for reducing pressure on North Korea. And even when North Korea does a provocation, China will say, well, can't you two Koreas get along? And it's only their Korea that's acting up. So the U.S. believes that we shouldn't front load benefits simply as an inducement to getting them back to the negotiating table or dialogue, that sanctions were a response to North Korean behavior, whether it was nuclear or missile violations of UN resolutions, or some cases it's criminal activity or human rights violations. So the U.S. would say that North Korea should change its behavior prior to having sanctions relief. Now, if we got back into dialogue, if North Korea deigned to have dialogue, then many things could be on the table, including relaxation of UN sanctions. But we need to get back to the table, and North Korea has been the impediment.
And do you think North Korea is perhaps using engagement with China and more recently South Korea as well to gain leverage against the United States?
Right. Well, the Moon administration would have provided large amounts of economic largesse if it hadn't been for international sanctions, as previous progressive governments had. But South Korea, like the other countries in the world, are constrained by U.S. laws and UN sanction resolutions. So President Moon is pushing for various inducements to North Korea. In the past, it was relaxation of sanctions. The current iteration is an end of war declaration, which the U.S. is also against as simply an inducement to get them back to dialogue. So I think we have a difference of view between Washington and Seoul on prioritization and timelines of which actions to do first. But we're in agreement on the end goal. But behind the scenes, there's resistance to President Moon's push for an end of war declaration, or previously when he was pushing for sanctions relaxation.
And well, right now, due to the severe food shortage in North Korea, South Korea and the United States, their top envoys on North Korea, they've been discussing humanitarian aid for weeks and weeks. But what's been stalling the progress on that?
I think, again, it's the ball is in North Korea's court. A year ago or year and a half ago, President Trump offered COVID assistance, and North Korea rejected that. South Korea had offered 11 million tons of rice, and North Korea rejected that. They also rejected offers of the Chinese COVID vaccine. So that's really part of a long, long trend. When the U.S. or South Korea or others have tried to offer assistance, North Korea has rejected it, whether now it's fear of COVID infection coming in on any kind of shipments. But it's been reluctant to open its country up to the outside world. And there's a lot of misperception by people that there are restrictions, sanctions restrictions on humanitarian assistance, and that's not the case. There are no sanctions whatsoever on food, medicine, or humanitarian assistance. But it has to go through a system where we make sure they're not dual use capable or whatever. But the U.S. has repeatedly offered and would offer if North Korea came back to not even a negotiating table, but simply dialogue with U.S. counterparts.
And well, meanwhile, it seems that China is extending a helping hand to the North, which it is reportedly accepting. How should the U.S. and South Korea make sure that China doesn't gain the upper hand in terms of engagement with North Korea and the ability to influence it?
Well, we have to continue to enforce sanctions and U.S. laws against any entity that's violating them, and that includes Chinese. We know from the UN panel of experts that Chinese entities have been violating. We know it from other sources as well. And for several administrations in the United States, we've been reluctant to go after Chinese entities. Back in 2018, President Trump announced there were 300 North Korean entities that he wasn't sanctioning, even though we had evidence against them. And in 2017, the U.S. Congress sent a list of 12 Chinese banks, including the 4 largest in the world, that they felt were committing money laundering crimes in the United States, and the Trump administration didn't take action against any of them. We've imposed $8 to $9 billion in fines in the past on British and French banks for money laundering for Iran, and so far we've imposed $0 in fines on any Chinese bank for money laundering for North Korea. So there are things we could be doing to Chinese banks and businesses that would hopefully induce them to stop engaging with North Korea in violation of UN resolutions.
And of course, as you mentioned before, President Moon has been pushing for an end of war declaration. And while some are quite wary of this idea, though, as it might be reason having such a declaration might be reason for North Korea and perhaps even China to push for the removal of US troops from the Korean Peninsula. What are your views on this?
I think an end of war declaration is not a good idea. And the Moon administration, when it's pushing for people to agree to it, really highlights its uselessness. They'll say it's only a political document, a diplomatic document. It'll actually have no effect whatsoever. Why not sign it? Well, the very reason that it has no effect is the reason. But it carries the risk of a perception of peace on the peninsula. Could lead to calls for, if the war is over, why not bring U.S. troops home or reduce them? I think instead of a meaningless end of war declaration, instead we should work towards a permanent peace treaty, as we were in the six-party talks before North Korea walked out. But that would require addressing the North Korean conventional force threat to the south. We want to reduce that. And we could use measures as we did in the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, which I was a part of the negotiating team, where we capped and then reduced and thinned out the forces along what was then in essence the European DMZ between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. So we need to also implement confidence and security building measures. But that has to be the end of a lengthy negotiations as opposed to just meaningless gesture to try to get North Korea back to the dialogue.
What do you think it really wants to see the US do before it actually engages in dialogue?
Well, the accusations of a U.S. hostile policy have been a long-standing trope of North Korean propaganda. But it's North Korea that has the hostile policy. They're the ones that have committed acts of war and acts of terror and deadly attacks on South Korea and U.S. forces. And you know, they want the U.S. or South Korea to offer concessions even before North Korea agrees to any kind of concessions and drive a wedge between the U.S. and our allies in Asia by calling for end of war declaration, a reduction of troops, et cetera. But you know, one other additional factor besides just negotiating tactics by North Korea could be COVID. You know, right now, North Korea has two ambassadors in China because when the one that was replaced, he couldn't go back into the country because of COVID restrictions. There are North Korean students in China who can't go back into the country, and other ambassadors overseas who have not been able to go back. So it could be that if North Korean diplomats left the country to meet with U.S. counterparts, they could not go back into the country. So that may be one additional factor hindering diplomacy. And along with that, North Korea usually does a major provocation, of Icbm test or a nuclear test, the first year in a new U.S. and or South Korean administration. And they haven't done that this time with the Biden administration, even though they've done many shorter range missile tests. And maybe it's if those actions are designed to drive the U.S. back to the table in a softer way, if they won't go back to the table, maybe they will hold off on those major provocations until COVID conditions allow for diplomacy.
Well, in the meantime, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said that the North continues to remain unresponsive to US overtures for dialogue. And while some observers say that more needs to be done to bring North Korea to the dialogue table, others are saying that there should not be any compromises made without reaching some solid understanding on denuclearization. What do you think is the best way to break the deadlock right now?
Well, the deadlock is because North Korea refuses to have dialogue, let alone negotiation. So and that's led some people to say, well, let's offer more concessions. And if those don't work, let's offer yet more and more. And we've offered many concessions in the past. In fact, the last 4 years, we have been canceling or reducing or constraining our military exercises at the risk of degrading allied deterrence and defense capabilities. That didn't get us anything in return from North Korea, either cessation of their own military exercises, such as the winter training cycle, or any kind of diplomatic gesture in response. So, you know, many things could be on the table if North Korea just came back into the room. But, you know, we have to keep in mind it's North Korea that's in violation of 11 UN resolutions, as well as numerous US laws. It's North Korea that has a hostile policy. It's North Korea that's conducted deadly attacks. So the U.S. and its allies shouldn't be eager to throw benefits over the wall to North Korea just to get them back to the table. It's, police don't offer benefits to criminals to induce them to stop misbehaving. It's when they take action to reduce their violations, then society can reward them or enter into discussions. But you don't want to just get into a slippery slope of offering more and more concessions in the hope that North Korea will then pocket them and then come back to the table where they'll demand yet more concessions.
Right, well, I'm afraid this is where we'll have to leave the interview today. That was Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you again so much for your time. It was a privilege to have you on our show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.